All right, good afternoon, and thanks everyone who's dialing in, and thanks for our participants for being here. I'm Felix Ungerman, and I'll be your moderator for today. For me, this is a very personal topic, as I've had family who were survivors of the Holocaust who unfortunately aren't with us anymore, but I've learned a lot in my time, and so I look forward to a rich discussion that will explore the topics of the Holocaust, education, and what we can do about it today and into the future. We have a great panel for you today. We have folks from the Institute of Holocaust Education with us. We have Dr. Thompson from the Omaha Mayor's Office, and we have a special guest here who is a Holocaust survivor, Dr. Cater, and we have Congressman Bacon here who's graciously hosting this Lunch and Learn event. So with that, I'd like to turn the microphone over to our first speaker, which is Dr. Fred Cater, who is a Holocaust survivor and what is called a hidden child from that period. He is currently a pediatric neurologist with his own private practice here in Omaha. He was an orphan child of the Holocaust and one of an estimated 4,500 such children who were hidden children during that event, and was the lone survivor of his immediate family. So with that, Dr. Cater, we'd love to hear your stories that you have to convey to us. Take whatever time you need, and we appreciate you being here this afternoon.
Thank you very, very much for inviting me to visit and to tell you my story and to be part of this wonderful plan of how we can influence the mind of children to eradicate anything that they hear that is hateful, that can only lead to troubles, like it did many years ago back in Europe, in Belgium, where I was. That led to the extension of the Holocaust into Belgium and the loss of more lives. But I was born in Belgium in 1938 in Antwerp, and
I'd like you to speak up a little bit.
Say it, okay. So I was born in Antwerp in 1938 in Belgium, and I have very little recollections of my past at that time, not really ever knowing that a war was on, not appreciating what was going on in the Holocaust, and not even realizing that the war was ending until it actually ended in 1945. By that time, I was 7 years old, so I could appreciate that there had been a war. And indeed, I remember the planes droning overhead as the Allies went to bomb into Germany. It's a good thing that in this day and age, we now have jets and the planes don't drone at night, so I don't wake up anymore like I did before. But it wasn't until 45 that I realized what was going on. And I realized I was in an orphanage. Everybody there was in the same boat. Nobody had family that they were aware of. And when the war ended, the place started to empty out. The home of Wiesenbeek emptied out as people were being picked up by family, by parents if they were still alive, until very few of us were left. And with very little supervision, I began living a life from day to day for 2 years, till 1947, when I was 9 years old. And I have very little recollections of that also. One day, a gentleman came to Wiesenbeek and told me he was my uncle. And he had learned about me by pure accident. He had survived, a social worker had survived, and they knew each other. And he said that he had lost everybody except his family that he was able to manage and save. She says, well, I'm not so sure. She had a list of hidden children, and she mentioned to him that there was a Franz Jeruzelski, which was my original name. Even though his name was Jeruzalimski, he was my uncle. And so he came to get me, left the orphanage. I do remember the electric train ride as a kid, going to Brussels. Crazy things you remember, important things you remember. And got to live with his family, his wife and 2 children. And to be very honest, it turned out to be a fiasco. I didn't know how to live with people. whatever family I had had before the war had obviously been taken away from me. We lived in a orphanage where everything was done by age and group, little cliques, little groups, being supervised by people who could look after us. And then for 2 years being on my own, I must have been a little devil, to say the least. So I had this problem, and no matter how much my uncle and his wife and the 2 children, my cousins tried, I just couldn't manage it. I just couldn't get along. I just couldn't live properly. Went to school and came home, and the argument started. Unfortunately, my great aunt, whose maiden name was Jozowski, also heard about me being alive from my uncle. Family after the war was always trying to get a hold of families, and big oceans in between didn't seem to stop anything like that. So my great aunt found out about me and wanted me to come to live with them. And so when I was 11, in 1949, I came to my great aunt and uncles and family's house in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. And initially, things weren't the smoothest either. I figured I had been in an orphanage, and I was with my uncle, now I was with another aunt, and in a couple of years I'll be further down the road again. And fortunately, though, time went by, and my great aunt and her family, 5 boys and a daughter, and some of their children, because the older half of the family was already married and had children. They worked very hard to make it register in between my eardrums that I was wanted here, that they wanted to make a life for myself, for me. They wanted me to be someone who would be a decent person. And I was accepted not just by my adoptive brothers and sister, but even their kids actually called me uncle and accepted me for who I was, no questions asked. And it took a while, not just a little while, took a long while, till I finally started to appreciate what was going on around me and with me. And indeed, I started to realize that they were interested in my welfare. They were interested in the love that they showed me. It was real. It wasn't just a transient, temporary thing. And being accepted by nieces and nephew, my own age, made it that much easier to relate. And I think this is what finally, more than anything else, got me out of the doldrums of not being a very nice kid, and started to become a better person. As time went by, as the family grew, and as got older, I ended up going to high school and started to learn from history what had happened during the war. Did a lot of reading on my own, novels and books and learned about this horrible Holocaust that had happened, and got the message that I had survived a terrible thing. And I didn't know what had happened. I didn't even realize, like I said, for a long time there was a war, but I made up the lost segments of that story as time went by. And indeed, as I got through high school, I started to realize that I was going to go to college. There wasn't any doubt in anybody's mind in my family that I was going to be the first one going to college. And I started to think of what was I going to do with myself. And I realized by now that I had indeed survived because of specifically very specific reasons. people were out there, even before I met my family, who obviously had done the right thing because it was the right thing to do. At the age of 4, I couldn't have survived on my own. I knew that I had to have been helped, and people were out there to show that even in the face of this terrible conflagration of the Holocaust that killed 12 million people, 6 million Jews and 6 million non-Jews, there were people out there who indeed were doing the right thing to save people, to be of support, and to make sure they had a chance to live. And so I figured, even going through high school, I knew that I wanted to help people, and I was being kind of driven by that fact. So why, what had happened to make me this way, I had no clue. But I realized no matter what, I was going to get educated, and somehow I was going to help people. And I decided that I had to answer the question for myself. And so in the mornings when I would wash, I would look in the mirror and I would say, Fred, by this time I had changed my name from France to Francois when I was in Belgium, to Fred when I got to Montreal, speaking English. And I said, what are you going to do with yourself? And I said, well, I'm just in high school. I got time. I can wait till tomorrow to decide. Trouble is, tomorrow kept on coming. And finally, one day, I looked in the mirror and I said, what in God's tarnation are you going to do with yourself? And then the thought came, if my parents were alive, what would they want me to do? And that I had to answer once and for all. And I realized that it took a long time, but I had become a decent human being. I had become a mensch, as they say in Yiddish. My family, who adopted me in Montreal, got me turned around, and I stopped being a dumb little kitty as I grew up and realized that I had a life to live, and the thing to do was to indeed become a decent human being and help people exactly like I had been thinking about. And so by the time I got to college, I knew I was going to be a doctor, in spite of the limitations and the imposition of quotas that still existed in those days. I knew I was going to fight it no matter what. And I would become a doctor. And eventually in time, you start asking yourself the question, who needs the most help? And always all I had to do was look in the mirror. If you're a little kid on your own, you need the most help. And if you look at medicine, you wonder, if you're going to be a pediatrician, what exactly are you going to do? You're going to help kids who need the most help. And those are kids who unfortunately have neurological diseases. Kids who can't walk properly because they have muscular dystrophy, muscle diseases. Kids who have unfortunate congenital malformations that can't think properly, can't learn, can't adapt. And so kids who had neurological diseases were obviously the ones that needed the most help. So it doesn't take away from the help that cardiologists gave and orthopods gave. But I felt it was the neurology problem, children who needed the help. And so by the time I got to college, I was already indeed doing experimental psychology because I was interested in the brain, and it led on towards going through college, not as an end in itself, but as a stepping stone towards medical school. And by that time, I knew I was going to be a pediatric neurologist. And it is what I've done for almost 50 years. At the end of college, I was on my road, and I had finally gotten to where I was able to do something in turn for what had been done for me, for me to survive and for me to have a future that was useful and proper and right. I met my wife the last summer before I did my last year of medical school, I knew that once I became a doctor, I wouldn't have the time of the day left for myself. I would be too busy with the kids. And so decided to take the summer off. And I decided to go catch up with a friend who lived out in California, being a math professor. I had very few friends, but each had a very specific positive influence on me, and I was going to go see Al in California, and I got a ride with someone who was also in medicine, going to Seattle to do an externship before he even actually started medical practice at the Seattle. This was in the Seattle Children's Physical Rehab Hospital. And I mentioned that to my sister, and she mentioned that, you know, we have family here that you remember who lived in Montreal. My uncles had family here. And his sister had married and had a family, and they had moved out west to the West Coast. And my sister said, you should go visit. And I said, well, yeah, I'm going to be in Seattle, but you know, it's really your family and not mine. I want to get to California. And she said, don't worry about it. You'll get there, but if you don't go, don't expect to have a bed to sleep under, let alone on top of when you come home. And we're not pitching a pup tent in the backyard for you either if you don't go visit family. So I got the message and got there in Seattle, rang the bell of this cousin that had also been married. I originally was a caterer and became a Barona. And the daughter was living in Seattle, rang the bell. And this young lady opened the door and was very polite and very pleasant and was also very good looking. And I realized that she was not one of their daughters because they had 4 girls who were small, smaller, youngest, younger, smaller, smaller. Mm-hmm. So when she introduced her husband, when Ruth Eisler introduced her husband to me and the 4 children that she had, she said, that's my sister Sarah. And I said, oh, the one I heard about who likes to drive convertible cars in California. Mm. And she said, yeah, she hasn't made it yet. But it took me 3 times to get the message because I always kept on saying, yeah, that's your sister in California, and she was right there. But that's how I was to meet Sarah, who I spent part of the summer with. And then I talked to her about going back to Canada because I had to go home and finish the last year of medical school. And I said, there's no cell phone in this day and age, and I'm not going to keep up a long-distance conversation. So she went back to Canada, and within a month of being back home and starting my 4th year, I realized I didn't want to be alone anymore. I think I had met the person that I wanted for the rest of my life. And so after the med school year finished, I walked down the aisle, got my diploma. Next day I walked down the aisle and got me a wife. And it's a good thing too, because as I continued my training after, during med school and afterwards, she looked after bringing up 3 kids of ours. And she looked after the everything that had to be done, not just with children, but with the home. And she turned out to be my rock of Gibraltar. I still had some bad quirks from when I was a kid, and I would suddenly just do strange things. But she was my rock of Gibraltar and kept me going in the right direction. And it's a good thing, too. But I got my training at Hopkins in neurology. Then I went up to New York and Albert Einstein, Shiva University, and got my pediatric neurology training. And then decided to, when I graduated, I didn't want to be part of the Canadian brain drain. This was a time of wars and the United States being involved in wars, and I figured I'd spend enough time in the States. I think I better get home and help the kids in Canada who needed my help. And got home, but I was just too well trained. It took me a long time to become a pediatric neurologist. I was a slow learner, again, 12 years. So there just weren't enough universities. Population of Canada being, 1/10 of the United States population. And there just wasn't enough universities and positions available. So I decided to come back down to the States and found out about a position here. Met the pediatric neurologist in Omaha and told him that he was going to have to convince my wife that Omaha was not all flat with just a lot of corn growing if we were going to come down here. And that's exactly what Dick Pellegrino did. And my wife says when she was driving through Omaha when we came to visit with the hills and the parks and beautiful surroundings, we decided, she said, oh, Montreal was, and Vancouver were fine, but there's nothing wrong with Omaha for the future. And so this is when I joined in December '74, the University of Nebraska Medical Center.
Wow.
And landed up in Omaha. Parked the car in the house we bought, took out the key from the ignition, never put it back in, never left. So I've been here for 44 years since, and started to indeed do what I wanted to do, look after kids at the university, teaching, being involved with medical care. And for years, though, things had changed at the university. The neuroscience division was falling apart for financial reasons, and I decided I'd gotten to Omaha. I spent 4 years getting to know the pediatricians here, and that's fine. And decided that I was going to go into private practice instead of going somewhere else.
Yeah, we'll just get that thing. So if it's okay, I actually picked up a couple things I'd like to just ask you about.
Right.
So clearly you had endured some significant challenges and traumas during your upbringing, especially in your youth. But despite that, the things I heard you say were your determination to overcome it, to get past it, to find out who you were and go after that despite quotas, despite being a slow learner, despite language challenges, cultural changes, all of those things. And clearly, you've been incredibly successful. So I guess the question about your Holocaust experiences and how that translated into your life, what kind of lessons have you taught your children and your family and others about what you experienced in your life, similar to what you're doing now, but specifically for your children?
Well, what happened was that when I got to Canada, even though I worked my way through the difficulties, I was still facing the problem of hate. Mm-hmm. I went to grade school, and then in the afternoon, my great aunt figured that I should get a proper education, not just in the academics, but also in being a decent human being. And I would go to Hebrew school, to the Lubavitcher Yeshiva, which were the ultra-Orthodox people. And unfortunately, I had to pay the price for being able to go there, because every time I went through the lane from the street that we lived on to the next street over through a lane, there were the French kids. 2 or 3 of them were there every time. And the war may have been over, but the French kids in Montreal were still calling me, you damn dirty Jew, maudit juif, is the French expression. And I wasn't going to tolerate that. So by the time I got to beating them up and went into the Hebrew school, I had a torn shirt, I was missing buttons, I had all kinds of difficulties. And but I just persevered, and I knew what was going to happen every day that I went to the afternoon Hebrew school. The problem is that I also saw the reverse. When I got on the steps of the Hebrew school, the rabbi's son was there. and it was an Orthodox yeshiva. And those people wear an undergarment that has fringes on it to recall, their pledges that they made, to be Orthodox Jews to God. And I get there, and the rabbi's son now calls me, "You dumb goy," which means you're a dumb Gentile, because I used to take out the undergarments from my hip pocket to put it on before I went into the Hebrew school. So I had to beat him up. So here was a guy who was just doing the reverse of what I just went through. And so that stuck with me for a long time, that the hate was being passed both ways, and neither side had learned much from the war, and neither side had learned much from the Holocaust, and kids were still being brought up in a very different kind of fashion. And that was a problem. That stayed on my mind. The thing, though, is that while this happened in Montreal, I get to Omaha, and I am now going as a professor to teach educated young people who want to become pediatricians. And one day, I hear a bang, and somebody says, "Damn Jew machine." And went down the hallway, and sure enough, there's a gentleman standing there, and I say, what's the problem? And he said, "Well, I put my money in, I can't get my drink out, I can't get my Coke out, so this damn Jew machine doesn't want to give it to me." And I said, "Where'd you learn that expression?" He says, "Oh, I've heard that ever since I've been a young kid back home before I got to Omaha and to med school." And I looked at him and I said, we only known each other for a couple of months, but maybe you don't know it, but I'm a dirty Jew that you're talking about. I'm Jewish. You've never heard me say anything that way, one way or the other, to anybody about anything. And he says, "Well, maybe what I learned was wrong." And he apologized. And we eventually became friends, because he turned out to be very, very much more accepting of everybody.
Well, if I could stop you there, I hate to do that, because your story is compelling. I think that's a great segue for us to maybe ask a few questions of other panelists we have here, if that's all right with you. Clearly, that is something that exists everywhere we go in terms of slurs and hate. I guess, let's start with just the Holocaust education. So we're fortunate to have two folks here from the Institute of Holocaust Education, the Executive Director, Scott Litke, and the Educational Coordinator, Kale Sagir. So thank you all for coming. In the interest of time, I won't go through all your bios, but I really would like to just open up the floor for a few minutes to ask you, based on what he's conveyed and what you've seen and experienced and learned through what you're doing, what kind of education can we do to stop those types of things related to specifically the Holocaust, but maybe more in general?
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. The Institute for Holocaust Education is dedicated to a number of different things, but really we're trying to do, if we do a broad message, we want to teach empathy, we want to teach understanding, and we also want to teach the public not to be bystanders, to act. To get involved. And our mission, and excuse me for reading it, but it comes out a lot better that way. The Institute for Holocaust Education provides educational resources, workshops, survivor testimony, and integrated arts programming to students, educators, and the public. The IHE provides support to Holocaust survivors in our community. Our goal is to ensure that the tragedy and history of the Holocaust are remembered, that appropriate fact-based instruction and materials are available to students, educators, and the public to enable them to learn the lessons of the Holocaust, that as a result, we inspire our community to create a more just and equitable society. And I think the last sentence is really what we're doing, and that is to inspire others through the stories, especially of Dr. Cater's story, other survivors. There's approximately 19 people who we recognize as survivors in the state of Nebraska. They range from Dr. Cater being our youngest, up to being 101 years old. And we're trying to create a just and more equitable society. And Kale will tell you about some of the programming that we're doing.
We work with students grades 6 through 12. We also work with teachers in the area and throughout the state to give them some professional development on resources. But I have a lot of people who ask me, well, why the Holocaust? And we want to provide some historical context because the one thing that happened during the Holocaust was what we say the unthinkable became thinkable. Things that this idea of genocide that was before that not very well understood. So this is a perfect opportunity to study not only history, but civic awareness, like the fragility of our democratic institutions, human behavior, both the best and the worst of it, and this idea of moral courage and hard choices, which is how we hopefully will develop this better world, right? Like John Paley in the paper today, the War Refugee Board, and all these people who helped, who did the right thing and helped Dr. Cater. And as Scott was saying, this idea of being a bystander versus being an upstander, this idea that we all have choices, even if they're hard and even if they're not good. And so how we do that, we have a speakers bureau where Dr. Cater is one of our speakers that we keep very busy to go out to schools and organizations to tell their stories. We have our Week of Understanding coming up at the end of March, where we will bring in other survivors and speakers, and we reach between 5,000 and 6,000 area students at that time. We have Art in the Holocaust competition for area middle schoolers. We have an essay contest for high schoolers. And we have this Searching for Humanity exhibit that is on permanent display out at the Strategic Air and Space Museum in Ashland, which is one of my favorite programs because we have area students come out for a full day field trip where they go through the exhibit. They have a lesson on the bystanders versus upstanders. They have a lesson with the ADL about an anti-bias and bully lesson. And then they get to hear a survivor in the afternoon. And this generation of students is the last generation that will have that privilege. And so it is very important to us that this goes on, because even though the unthinkable became thinkable and people said never again, we have seen it over and over again. We've seen it in Cambodia and Bosnia and Rwanda and the Sudan and with the Rohingya Muslims. And those are just to name a few of this idea of what can happen when we do not see ourselves and other human beings, when we think of them as other or less than human.
So just if I could ask for just a little bit more, what kind of things do you see on the near-term horizon, or where are you trying to get to beyond what you're working right now?
My goal personally is to expand our professional development and teacher outreach to outside of the metro area. I'm going to Scotts Bluff this month. It's February now. And I would like to reach more teachers through the ESUs in Nebraska. Because Holocaust education is not mandatory in the state, our standards do not indicate topics, they indicate concepts. And so it is very difficult for teachers to fit Holocaust education into the curriculum. Teachers have a lot of things to do. And then when they do, there are so many resources and not all of them are good. And so what I would like to do is present our teachers statewide with, this is an easy way to do it in a very limited amount of time. And this is why we think it's really important, and how you can check multiple boxes with one topic.
Excellent. Anything else, Dan?
Well, I said that we're forming new partnerships with one person, one group, one large group, one small group, and exactly what Kale said. We're really trying very hard to reach out past Lincoln and getting into the further into the panhandle of the state, into the furthest parts of the state, and also into western Iowa. And we're working with the universities. We have an exhibit up right now in the Weber building at the at the University of Nebraska-Omaha. We just finished a wonderful week with a scholar who we had come in, and it's all about not having to do it alone, that there's a lot of people dedicated to the same causes that we're dedicated to, and we're teaching the same message. So we're minimally successful. We're working on being incredibly successful.
Actually, the success goes much further than this. I have had the privilege of talking to a local school situation here, and because somebody in Hawaii knew somebody in Omaha who knew that there was an educational ability situation from surviving Holocaust people through Skype. I ended up talking to a couple of classrooms that were put together in Hawaii. And the feedback came through. And so you never know, it's the people you meet, the people you know. And this was a medical person who was in medical school with my son, who had their children in a very special Catholic school situation in Hawaii. And so we've actually reached out all the way to Hawaii, don't have to swim there.
Well, we might have taken it a little further. We're on the internet right now. We have no idea who might be watching or listening to us right now, but hopefully people as far as Hawaii or maybe even beyond.
Is this a good time to plug our website?
Sure, if you'd like to, go ahead.
And I was going to say, Dr. Cater has a fascinating story, and we have more of it on our website under our Survivor tab with all our local survivors. So, if you're one of those curious people that would like to know more of the details of his childhood, you can find that on ihene.org.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we appreciate all the work that you're doing and the many survivors that you're giving a voice to. And thank you for being here as well. Let me turn now to Dr. Thompson, who many know as a former city councilman, but also as an educator and very involved in the community as a leader. Dr. Thompson, you're in charge of the mayor's Human Rights and Relationship Department. I'm sure you've had plenty of experiences throughout your life and your work now to see how some of this affects not just the Holocaust survivors and others in a Jewish community, but talk to us about the community writ large and what you're doing and what you think we can do better.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you, Dr. Cater, for making my week. Not only are you here for Holocaust education, you're also here for what I call Murphy's Kids. You know Murphy's Law, if it could go wrong, it would go wrong.
Everybody picks on Murphy. We've been talking about that this morning.
As incredible as it sounds, we have children here in the state who, from the moment they left the hospital and came home, everything went wrong. But your story is great because it says you can beat it. And man, is that a powerful story. Now, the reason why I'm so emotional about that is because I am a survivor, Murphy's child, grown up, and hearing your testimony lets me know I'm going to push on. I'm not going to give up. But I also wanted to say that when it comes to Holocaust education, some people teach it in a very thin way. You read 2 or 3 pages and then you move on to something else. A lot of people don't know there were more than one Holocaust. Some of the first ones were way back in the Old Testament. And then the Romans came in 70 AD and told everybody to get out of Israel, the diaspora. And then you can go just the Middle Ages, the Renaissance era. Some people will say that Hitler killed so many people, but it was in a compact time frame. What about the pogroms in Russia? More people died there than in Nazi Germany. So the Holocaust is more than just a German Hitler thing. It's a thing that's been kind of going on for a long time. And that my culture, we feel a kinship because with the Middle Passageway of slavery, the millions that were thrown overboard or tried to swim to America or swim back to Africa, of course they died. So this is a powerful topic, and I'm just glad that someone's out there doing it. I also like the concept that you talked about, checking multiple boxes using one unified theme. And perhaps the biggest thing that educators are not doing right now, and they're not doing it on purpose, it's kind of subconscious or perhaps it's part of the system, but we're not teaching the real root enemy. We always say, well, your religion, your skin color, your language, those are symptoms. Those are symptoms of something else deeper. And the real problem is greed and the abuse of power and privilege. That is our enemy. And until we can teach that, we won't solve the problem. In the southern part of the United States, there were slave owners that knew that black people weren't 3/5 of a person. They knew that. Some of them believed it, but some of them knew that that was a bunch of hogwash. But why did they keep believing it? Ka-ching, you go all the way to the bank with it. So the real enemy is greed and the abuse of power and privilege. And until we learn that lesson, we'll continue to spin and toil and turn, and we won't reach that dream that Martin Luther King keeps talking about.
I have to ask, what kind of things are you working on in your office now? Community outreach programs or things that get after this in an education way?
Well, prior to my coming, most of the education piece was educating you about the law and educating you that somebody was going to get you. It became a gotcha department. Well, I've decided to expand that. So we want to get out in front of, not get you when you do something bad, but we want to get in front of it and say, this is some things that your great leaders were trying to get you to see. So let's get out there and let's do those things. For example, we just recently brought all the high schools together and we had them do fine arts things in regarding to do away with, or not do away with, but eliminate. Doing away with is an impossibility on this side of what I call heaven, but to reduce all of this, inhumanity to one another. We're doing things like brown bag sessions. We're out there teaching. We're out there encouraging people to be better human beings. And in summary, I'd say we're pushing the concept of being a change agent. And I want to start young before they're, hardened in their view. Teach people how to be change agents.
I got a question for you too, Dr. Thompson. Thank you for being here. He's been a good friend for a long time, and so I just appreciate you sharing. I agree that greed and abuse of power is a big part of this, but it seems to me in some of these cases that we saw in Germany and in Europe, there was scapegoating. It's easy to maybe blame someone else for problems that you're encountering. And it seemed to me that there was some of that going on. How does that fit in when life isn't perfect from your perspective, and sometimes leaders demagogue and demonize other people to sort of channel that anger away where it really needs to go? And I saw some of that in the Holocaust.
There is counseling research that says the people who are the hardcore bigots actually suffer a personality deficit. And if you look at Hitler's background, there was all kinds of things that went wrong as a child. And so rather than blame mom, dad, blame whatever, what we do, we project.
Right.
You're projecting off on.
Yeah, it's my term.
And so some of that did go on, but I do want you to know that in the Hitler theology, he wanted to gain a lot of land and a lot of resources for his people. So even with the scapegoating, there was an economic reason to still do it.
And theft.
You see? So I'm going to help the Aryans by stealing from someone else, and
Well, thank you.
Gypsies, Jews, people who had disabilities, they all went to the gas chambers.
Right. Thank you for sharing.
So that's a good time to turn to our congressman who, in his own right, has been working on some of these issues that started with your civility pledge that you took as a freshman member back in 2017 with all the other freshman class members from both sides of the aisle to dedicate to a civil dialogue, respect for each other, and healthy debate. In addition, you've worked on a number of pieces of legislation that cover things like anti-Semitism and protecting some of those programs that are in that area. One in particular that may dial in a little bit more to this forum was the one that you sponsored with Democratic House member Carbajal, Salud Carbajal, about never again education to ensure that there is education about the Holocaust and hate that is in our schools. So with that, I'd just like to ask you, what kind of things maybe in those veins have you worked on, and what are your thoughts about?
Well, I really appreciate you moderating and the folks who put this together. Scott and Kale, thanks for what you do. I appreciate your role in our community. And Dr. Thompson, like I say, I appreciate his friendship and his leadership. Dr. Cater, thank you for sharing. I just couldn't imagine the trauma of losing parents, siblings, being moved, and not really knowing because you were too young, but yet there was something not right, and you felt that trauma, and there was recovery to have to do that, and that happened 1 million times or 6 million times over. And so I appreciate you sharing. My story really started as I was raised in a home where we learned about the Holocaust, and my dad was a very good teacher on this, and I'm a history guy. I love reading history books. But I had head knowledge. And when you hear the numbers and you hear what happened, especially as a small guy and as a younger teenager, it's hard to maybe internalize some of that. Then I went to Israel at the age of 15, and I went through the Holocaust Museum, the first one, not the current one. And I just it just hit me so hard. As I was walking around as a 15-year-old, hearing the stories, I internalized it. And I'll never forget the guy in front of my bus as we were leaving away. We were at the Knesset. That was the last stop. We went to the museum, then went to the Knesset, and he says, "We have that to ensure never again." And I was emotional. I remember just feeling it because I heard the stories from individuals. This is in the 70s, so there were a lot more survivors there. So it just stuck with me, and I never forgot it. And my first experience with anti-Semitism was I had a Jewish friend who was getting beat up because he was Jewish. And I intervened and ended up getting in a couple of fist fights myself with some kid in my hometown that I knew that I didn't know he was anti-Semitic, but he was picking on another kid who was also my friend. And that was sort of my first observation that this stuff goes on. And so I want to be a good voice on this. I think there's Dr. Franklin, I mentioned a lot of the motivations behind it. My thought is we do need the empathy that you mentioned, and the understanding and the engagement. I think this comes down to moral courage, as you just said. We need people who are willing to step up and be an individual and stand against the grain. And when they see something wrong, we have to have that to stop injustice when we see it. And I think the key part for me is education. We want to ensure that our youth know what happened, because I think that's the best. It's not the only step, but it's one of the key steps that it's part of the never forget, but that's the important part of never again, because you can have it happen again if we do forget. And I just think we need to make sure we're teaching them all in our schools. So that's the reason why I wanted to get behind that bill with Salud Carbajal, to make sure that our schools have focus on this for a day or so, however they want to delegate. But we need to have some focus every year on this topic, I believe. And then I've also supported various other anti-Semitism bills. One in the Department of Education to make sure they start reporting on anti-Semitic acts that we see as part of the Civil Rights Act, to expand upon that. But also dealing with what we're seeing in Europe right now, where we're seeing more and more acts of anti-Semitism in Europe, and to speak out against it. But where I'd really like to make a difference in this area is to help with the education in our local schools. And I want to be a part of that voice. So anyway, I want to thank Dr. Cater again for sharing. I think it's important for folks to hear, and this will always be on record, and I know you have it also on record with your organization, but we appreciate it. Trying to think what else to share on this. I think when it comes to something that Felix was saying here, part of the problem I think we have in our society today is we tend to dehumanize our opponents. And politics shouldn't be this thing of dehumanizing and making an enemy of the other side. We can have disagreements on what we think the role of government is, how much taxation, how much should it be state level or federal level. These are good debates, and good people can differ on this, but we've gotten in this phase of dehumanizing and attacks. And I think whether it's on the Democrat or the Republican side, we got to stop that and be a voice. And it starts with our president, but all the way down to our senators, our congressmen, our local officials. I think we need to be a voice of civility. So I have made that pledge. I'm in various groups to say I'm going to debate. I'm going to debate with vigor, but in the end, I'm going to respect my opponent in the process, and we can come together as silver Americans first when it's all said and done. And I think we could have this go overboard when we do dehumanize our enemy, because then ends justify the means when you go after your opponents, and that's not right. That's not what we want. And so hopefully that's a little bit of the philosophy that we're trying to put out as now a second-term congressman.
Well, as is with these lunch and learns, they're very lucrative. We've heard a lot of great things. There are people watching online, and we know that because we've gotten some feedback from online. A number of questions and comments have been put out there, so I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say thank you all for tuning in with us today and listening to this. Also, thank you for your questions, and unfortunately, we may not have time before this cuts off here on the hour, but at least we wanted to say that those questions are out there. We know that, and hope that you can tune in for our next Lunch and Learn or any future opportunities to ask those questions and get answers to your questions. But before we just completely shut down here, are there any thoughts that we haven't presented with a minute or so left that you want to make sure are discussed here or put out to the folks listening? Please, sir.
During World War II, there were boatloads of Jewish passengers that came to America, and they were turned away. They had to go to Canada, they had to go to Sweden. So a Holocaust isn't just a physical thing. It can also be economic, it can be emotional, it can be spiritual. And we're not that more innocent than some of the other people throughout the history.
It's a great point. Unfortunately, with the question we really kind of had was, how do you see it today? Has social media changed the game in how people delve into more uncivil discord? Is that a problem or a solution? Things like that. Maybe with about 30 seconds, would you want to comment about that?
Thank you. I had the privilege last week to hear Rabbi Jeff Myers speak. Rabbi Myers was the rabbi at Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. He happens to be a friend of mine, and had a conversation with him. And he said, I don't use the H word anymore. And if we look at social media, the amount of hatred and bigotry and baseless comments that are going on, we have to think about that. And I believe strongly in the First Amendment. So I believe it's a personal control that one has to show. And I think that we need to do that. I think that we need to recognize the stories that people's right to express their opinion, but not their right to harm each other. And to think twice before what they put on there. Write it out, look at it. Is this really what you want to say? And then don't necessarily post it.
That's what Abraham Lincoln advised.
Okay, exactly. Just one point with what was just said. The ship, the St. Louis, that had 900 passengers on it. On May 1st, in our community, we are bringing in Scott Miller, who wrote a book about this experience, and with our annual observance of Holocaust Memorial Day, Yom HaShoah, he'll be speaking at 7 o'clock in the evening at Temple Israel about this very topic and about our obligation to stand up for each other, and exactly what the congressman said as far as that we have an obligation to civility.
Well, there is obviously so much more we could talk about on this, so I anticipate there will probably be a second Lunch and Learn in the future to continue the conversation, but I think we're out of time at this point. So, Congressman, if you want to sign us off.
Thank you, each one of you. And Dr. Cater, thanks for sharing your story. I think it's so vital. for who is listening today, but our local community, our schools. Thanks for being part of the SAC Museum and bringing in our youth there. So, and I think this is it's going to be an ongoing effort. We want to make sure that our youth, all of our population, understands what happened in the Holocaust, why it happened, and what can we do to make sure it doesn't ever happen again in our country. Or I think our country has a role too, to be a strong voice in the world, to minimize what happens in other countries and other places where this is going on. So I think there is a role. America has the ability to be a good voice and a strong voice, but it takes strong citizens to be a part of that, to make that happen. So thank you for everyone that's listening today and participating. Appreciate it.
We'll keep on talking.
Yes, sir.